Robbers pick on poor fishermen, not knowing Jason Statham was watching. It started like any other quiet morning along the coast. The fog hung thick over the shoreline, waves lapping gently against worn wooden boats. A frail old man, shoulders bent from decades of labor, was setting up his tiny stall, selling fish he'd caught before dawn. His name was Elias. He was poor, honest, and utterly harmless. The kind of man who offered you food even if he hadn't eaten himself. But kindness, in a world like this, doesn't always buy peace. Because while Elias laid out his meager catch, 3 shadows emerged from the alley behind him, hard footsteps on cracked pavement, the kind that make birds scatter before they're even close. They didn't come to buy. They came to take. Without warning, the first blow landed. A kick to his ribs, then a punch to the side of his head. His basket of fish spilled across the dirt, and the air filled with cruel laughter. One of them spat at his feet, snarling, "Where's the money, old man? Or do we have to break your hands again?" People watched. Nobody moved. Fear clung to the air like the salt in the breeze. But there was someone else. Someone who didn't look away. A stranger, leaning against a rusted lamppost just beyond the dock, eyes locked on the scene. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He just watched. His name was Jason Statham. And in that moment, as the gang kept hitting that old man, Jason didn't see a poor fisherman. He saw someone he'd failed before. And this time, he wasn't going to walk away. Elias woke up before the sun every morning, his body aching from years of hard work, but his spirit unwavering. He lived in a small, weather-beaten house right by the water, nestled between the cliffs and the open sea. His life was simple. The salt in the air, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the screeching gulls overhead, these were his constant companions. There was a certain peace to it, a quiet rhythm that had come to define him. And yet, the world had changed around him. Elias was once a man of many things, father, husband, fisherman, friend. But time had stolen much from him. His wife, Maria, had passed away years ago from a sickness that came too quickly, too unexpectedly. Her absence had left an emptiness that never fully healed, one that clung to him even as he tried to fill his days with work. He would never speak of it, but on the coldest mornings, when the wind howled through the cracks in his door, he would swear he could still feel her warmth in the kitchen, hear her laughter floating through the house. Those were the days when he missed her the most. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of handling nets, would tremble ever so slightly as he set to work. But there was someone else to care for now, someone who kept him moving, kept him grounded. His grandson, Tomas. A boy with bright eyes and a mischievous grin, Tomas had come into Elias' life when everything else seemed to have faded away. His daughter had died giving birth to him, leaving the infant in the arms of the old man who hadn't quite known how to be a father again. But he learned quickly. Elias wasn't a man of many words, but in the way he cared for Tomas, he showed him the kind of love only time and hardship could teach. Every day, Elias would rise early and take his boat out into the churning sea. Tomas would often join him, standing at the edge of the dock, his small hands gripping the wood tightly as he watched his grandfather disappear into the mist. The boy had already learned the rhythm of the tides, the feel of the nets, the way to read the weather from the sky. Elias taught him with patience, his old hands steady and sure. He couldn't offer much, no riches, no fancy toys or clothes, but he could teach Tomas how to survive, how to find beauty in the simplicity of the sea. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The days were long, the work was hard, but it was honest. The fish Elias brought and fed them both, and the neighbors knew they could always count on him. He was the first to lend a hand when someone's roof leaked, the first to offer a bowl of soup when the storms raged too long. He wasn't a man of words, but he didn't need to be. His kindness spoke for itself. In a village that was often torn between the haves and the have-nots, Elias was a constant, a reminder that goodness, though quiet, could still thrive in the most unlikely places. But there was a sadness in his eyes, one that only those close enough could see. He never spoke of it. He never had to. The lines on his face told the story, the weight of years spent carrying burdens no one should ever bear, the grief of losing a partner, the hope that clung to him as he raised Tomas, even though the world seemed to spin faster and faster. Elias had learned the hard way that life was fragile, fleeting. People came and went, things changed. But the sea? The sea was constant. It was always there, steady and reliable. And that was enough for him. But no matter how steady the sea, no matter how simple his life had become, Elias couldn't escape the storm that was coming. And the people who would bring it. The ones who didn't see the quiet dignity in him. The ones who saw only weakness. And soon, they would come knocking at his door. For weeks now, Elias had heard whispers of a group of thugs who had been terrorizing the small vendors and fishermen in the area. At first, it was just rumors, stories from the fishermen at the docks about goods being stolen, and threats made in dark alleys. No one had the courage to stand up to them. Some had lost what little they had, and others had simply paid, hoping the men would leave them alone. But Elias never paid. He had nothing to give, nothing to lose. The sea was his life, and that's what he offered to the world. Nothing more, nothing less. He would rise before the first light, head out with his boat, and bring back whatever the ocean was willing to give. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him and Tomas fed. And that was all that mattered. But today, everything was about to change. Elias had just returned from the sea, his boat heavy with the day's modest catch. Tomas was already waiting for him on the dock, a small smile on his face as he watched his grandfather pull the boat in. The boy's eyes sparkled with excitement, eager to see what Elias had brought back, as if each day brought the promise of something new and special. But as Elias made his way up the dock, his heart sank when he saw them. The men, the thugs, standing at the end of the pier, their eyes locked onto him, as if they were waiting. They were tall, burly, with rough faces and eyes that had long since lost any sense of kindness. Their hands were large, calloused, and eager to grab whatever they could. Elias stopped in his tracks, his stomach tightening. Tomas, oblivious, skipped ahead, excited about the day's catch. But Elias felt a shift in the air, a dark, suffocating presence that made the hairs on his neck stand up. These men weren't here for fish. They were here for something else. One of the thugs, a heavy-set man with a crooked nose, stepped forward. He didn't speak at first, just watched Elias, his eyes scanning the old man with contempt. The others flanked him, arms crossed, as if they had all the time in the world to wait for Elias to make his next move. "Morning, Elias," the man said finally, his voice low and guttural. "We've been watching you." Elias' heart skipped. He knew what was coming, but he had no choice but to respond. He knew he couldn't outrun them, not physically, not with his aging bones. "Morning," Elias muttered, his voice hoarse from years of salt and wind. "What do you want?" The thug grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "Oh, we ain't wantin' much, old man," he said, sneering. "Just a little something for the trouble of having to be around here." Elias felt the tension in the air grow thicker. Tomas, still unaware of the situation, had stopped a few feet away, holding a small fish in his hand. Elias tried to keep his voice steady, trying to shield Tomas from whatever was about to happen. "I don't have anything," Elias said, his voice quieter now. "The sea's been hard on me. I've got no money to give you. Please, leave me be." The thug's face twisted into something darker, more menacing. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "No money? Is that so?" He glanced back at his friends, who were grinning now, clearly enjoying the discomfort they were causing. "You think we care? No one cares about you, old man. You'll pay up, or we'll take it out of you another way." Elias felt his chest tighten. He knew there was no reasoning with these men. He had seen them before, bullying the small vendors in town, breaking windows, and stealing goods without a second thought. But he wasn't like the others. He had nothing. "I swear," Elias said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't have anything. No money, no goods, nothing." The thug's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing dangerously. The others were stepping closer now, surrounding Elias. His heart was racing, but he stood tall, trying to keep his voice even, hoping for some kind of mercy. But mercy was a foreign concept to these men. Tomas stood frozen a few feet away, his small hands clutching the fish tightly, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. He could sense the danger in the air, the way the men towered over Elias, how their smiles were cold and empty. "You're wasting our time, old man," the thug said with a sneer. "Next time you don't pay, we'll take it from your bones. You'll wish you gave us what we wanted." The words hit Elias like a cold wave crashing against the shore. His blood ran cold, and for a moment he froze. The thug's words weren't a threat, they were a promise. And as much as Elias wanted to fight back, to stand tall and protect Tomas, he knew he had nothing to offer. Tomas' small voice cut through the tension, trembling. "Grandpa, what do they mean?" Elias swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic that was clawing at his chest. He could feel his hands shaking as he crouched down to Tomas' level, his heart breaking at the fear in his grandson's eyes. "They're just trying to scare us, Tomas," Elias said, his voice trembling. "We'll be fine. Don't worry." But even as he said the words, Elias knew the truth. He wasn't fine. and neither was Tomas. The thug laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. Yeah, just a little scare, he mocked, looking down at Elias as if he were nothing more than a pest. You better hope you have something to offer next time, or we won't be so kind. With that, the thug turned and motioned for the others to follow him. They walked away without a second glance, leaving Elias and Tomas standing on the dock, the cold wind whipping through the air, carrying the threat with it. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance, but the fear they left behind remained, heavy and suffocating. Elias watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel Tomas' eyes on him, searching for answers he didn't have. The sea, which had once felt like a place of peace, now seemed distant, unkind. Elias had nothing left to give, but somehow, he knew he had to protect Tomas. He wasn't sure how, but he had to, because if he didn't, the storm that was coming would swallow them both whole. Jason had always been good at staying invisible. It was a skill honed through years of working in the shadows, doing jobs that nobody asked questions about, jobs that left you with more blood on your hands than you'd ever care to admit. But for the first time in a long while, Jason found himself longing for peace, for a place where the world wouldn't chase him down with headlines or memories of the bloodshed. So, he chose a small coastal town, far from the noise, far from the chaos. It was a town that didn't ask questions, a place where everyone minded their own business, and where the locals never seemed to care much about strangers. Jason went by a different name now, a fresh start. There was no need to stand out. He kept to himself, found a small cottage on the outskirts of town, and kept a low profile. He didn't want anything to remind him of who he used to be. The past, with its tangled webs of violence, was better left behind. But on the morning Elias crossed his path, Jason couldn't help but notice something different about him. It wasn't just the old man's quiet demeanor or the fact that he looked like he had weathered years of hardship. No, it was the way Elias carried himself. He was gentle, despite the hard years he had lived through. His eyes carried a sadness, a weight that came from losing more than just time. It was a loss of hope. Jason could see it in the way Elias worked, the way he painstakingly fixed his nets, even though they were far from perfect. The old man never stopped. He worked, not because he had to, but because that was all he knew. Jason was sitting on a bench by the pier when he noticed Elias struggling with one of his nets. The thick ropes had tangled in a knot too tight for the old man to undo, and his fingers, worn and rough from years of labor, couldn't get a good grip. Jason watched for a moment, unsure if he should intervene, but something inside him stirred. He knew what it was like to struggle alone, to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. The kind of man who had no choice but to keep going, even when life seemed determined to break him. He stood up, almost without thinking, and walked over to Elias. You need a hand with that? Jason's voice was low, but it carried an authority that was unmistakable. Elias looked up, startled. He didn't expect anyone to approach him. Most people in town either ignored him or avoided him, thinking him too old or too stubborn to be of any real use. But here was this man, this stranger, offering help without hesitation. Elias hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly, trying to judge the man's intentions. But there was something about Jason, something that gave him a sense of calm, a sense of safety. Maybe it was the way he didn't come across as eager or desperate for attention, or maybe it was the quiet strength in his eyes that made Elias feel like he could trust him. I could use the help, Elias said, his voice rough from years of sea air and hard labor. Jason nodded, moving closer to the tangled net. The two of them worked in silence for a few moments, their hands moving in rhythm as they unraveled the knots. Jason was surprised at how quickly they made progress. There was a kind of silent communication between them, a bond forged through shared understanding. As they worked, Elias glanced up at him occasionally, his eyes studying Jason carefully. He wasn't a fool. He could tell that the man wasn't just some random traveler passing through. There was something about Jason, something dark in his past that he wasn't willing to talk about. But that was fine. Elias didn't pry. People had their secrets, and he had his own. After a while, they had the net undone. Jason stepped back, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. Elias stood slowly, his back aching from the work, but he felt a sense of gratitude for the help. Thanks, Elias said quietly. You're a stranger around here, aren't you? Jason offered a slight smile. Yeah, just passing through, he said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. He wasn't sure how long he'd stay in this town, but something about it felt different. Something about Elias felt different. Elias looked down at the net, then back at Jason. "You've got a good hand. You don't see many folks these days who take the time to help." Jason shrugged, his gaze distant. "I've learned a lot from the sea. It teaches you things. Patience. Respect." Elias chuckled softly. The sea has a way of humbling you." There was a pause, and Jason looked at Elias, really looked at him this time. The old man wasn't just a fisherman. He was a relic of a forgotten world, the kind of man who had seen everything, lost everything, and yet still found a way to carry on. Jason could feel a pull inside him, an unspoken connection. It wasn't pity. It wasn't sympathy. It was something deeper. Jason had lost a father of his own a long time ago, and though he had spent years pushing the pain away, a part of him still yearned for that connection. The feeling of being cared for, of having someone to rely on. Elias, in a way, reminded him of that. "You mind if I hang around for a bit?" Jason asked, his voice softer now. "I've got nowhere to go." Elias studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to understand Jason's true intentions. But after a few seconds, he nodded. "Sure. You can sit and rest a while," Elias said, gesturing to the dock nearby. "A man like you could use some peace." Jason smiled, but there was a quiet sadness in it. The kind of sadness that comes from knowing you've seen too much, lost too much. Yet somehow, in this small town, with this old fisherman who didn't know his past, Jason felt something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of peace. And as they sat on the dock, sharing a simple moment of quiet companionship, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of connection to Elias, an old, kind man who had nothing left but the sea and a grandson who looked up to him. Jason saw in Elias a father figure he had longed for, someone who had weathered the storms of life and kept going. Someone who had learned that no matter how hard things got, you keep moving forward. For the first time in a long time, Jason didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was running towards something, towards a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. It was still dark when the first sounds of commotion reached Jason's ears. The village was always quiet in the early morning hours, the only sounds being the gentle lapping of the sea against the docks, the distant calls of seagulls, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. But tonight, something was different. The air was thick with tension. Jason could feel it in his bones. Something was coming. He sat in the shadows near the edge of the village, hidden in the small thicket of trees where he often went to clear his mind. His thoughts were on Elias, and for the first time in days, he found himself feeling a strange connection to the old man. Maybe it was because Elias reminded him of his own father, the quiet, steady kind of man who didn't ask for anything but gave everything. Maybe it was the way Elias had offered him kindness, something Jason hadn't experienced in years. But tonight, all of that was about to change. The thugs, those men who had been terrorizing the small vendors and fishermen for weeks, had come back. And they weren't here for words this time. They were here for violence. Jason heard the sound of boots crunching on the gravel path. It was still early enough that the village was mostly asleep, but there were a few early risers, fishermen preparing their boats for the day, women heading to the market. None of them could have known what was coming. The thugs moved swiftly, and Jason's instincts told him they were already at Elias's hut. A shout pierced the quiet, then the unmistakable sound of a body hitting the ground. Jason's pulse quickened. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, though he knew there was no point in drawing it yet. He wasn't ready. Not yet. Through the thick brush, Jason watched, his eyes narrowing as the thugs barged into Elias's humble home. Their rough voices cut through the early morning stillness, demanding money, pushing Elias aside, ransacking the small hut that had been his home for so many years. The thugs laughed, loud, cruel laughs that reverberated in the quiet morning air. They tossed aside Elias's belongings with reckless abandon, shoving him to the ground without a second thought. One of the men kicked him, a sharp crack as Elias's body hit the dirt. Then Jason saw the worst part. The thug's eyes turned toward the small figure standing by the doorway. Elias's grandson, a boy no older than 10, stood frozen in fear, his wide eyes staring at the men who had come to destroy his world. Jason's heart clenched. The boy had no idea what was about to happen. All he knew was that these men, these monsters, were going to take everything from him. One of the thugs sneered and stepped toward the boy, grabbing him by the collar and lifting him off the ground. "This little brat is going to learn what happens when people don't pay up," the thug growled, his grip tightening. "Unless you want your grandson to pay the price, old man, You'd better get us what we want." Elias, bloodied and broken on the ground, tried to move, his body shaking with the effort. He coughed, barely able to speak. "Please. He's just a child." The thug's fist came down hard on Elias's face, sending him sprawling to the side, unable to protect his own flesh and blood. "I said, pay up." Jason felt the anger rise inside him like a tide, building higher and higher. He'd seen so many people broken in his life. He'd failed so many people who had trusted him. He could still hear their voices in his mind, voices of the men, women, and children he had been unable to save. Their faces were burned into his memory. He could hear them pleading for help. "Please, Jason. Please don't leave us." A flash of one face stood out in particular, Sarah. Her bloodied body lay in the dirt, a victim of the same kind of cruelty these thugs were dishing out. He'd been too late to stop it, too late to save her. Jason's fist clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his skin, and for a split second, the world around him seemed to blur. The shadows of the past, the people he couldn't save, filled his mind, drowning him in regret. Regret. It was the one thing Jason couldn't outrun. His heart beat in his throat as he watched Elias, helpless, trying to crawl toward his grandson, reaching out with a shaking hand, but the thugs just kicked him back down. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The rage inside him surged again, more powerful this time. The memories of his past failures mixed with the present. Elias wasn't just some old man. He was a father to his grandson. He was everything. He had no family left but this child. He had fought for every scrap of peace he could find. Jason couldn't stand by and watch this. For once, Jason wasn't running. For once, he was going to do something right. In a flash of motion, Jason moved through the shadows, his body trained to be silent, to remain unseen. His hand slid to the handle of the knife tucked in his jacket. His muscles tensed as he approached the thugs, his eyes narrowed. He wasn't thinking. He wasn't planning. He was simply reacting. The thugs continued their mockery, kicking Elias again and again, pushing the boy around as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. They didn't hear Jason coming. They never did. With one smooth motion, Jason launched himself from the darkness, his fist connecting with the first thug's jaw with a sickening crack. The man's head whipped back, and he fell, unconscious before he even hit the ground. The others barely had time to react. Jason was a whirlwind of violence. A trained killer moving like lightning, each blow precise and unforgiving. The next thug never had a chance to raise his weapon before Jason's knee connected with his chest, knocking the air out of him and sending him stumbling backward into a wooden barrel. The last thug, the one holding Elias's grandson, tried to pull a knife, but Jason was already on him, his hand wrapping around the man's wrist, twisting it violently until the knife dropped to the ground. Without a word, Jason slammed the thug's head into the nearby wooden fence, knocking him out cold. The fight was over as quickly as it had started. The thugs lay on the ground, incapacitated, their faces twisted in pain. Jason stood over them, breathing heavily, his body still coiled with adrenaline. His eyes, cold and deadly, surveyed the scene before he turned to Elias and the boy. Elias, battered and broken, lay on the ground, his body weak but his eyes full of gratitude. The boy stood beside him, shaking but unharmed, his wide eyes staring up at Jason in awe. Jason's hand, still holding the knife, relaxed. His shoulders slumped, the adrenaline slowly leaving his body. His gaze shifted back to Elias, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Jason felt something other than anger. He felt relief. He had saved someone. For once, he hadn't failed. The boy took a step toward him, his voice trembling. "Thank you, you saved us." Jason didn't respond immediately. He just looked at Elias, this old man who had nothing left but the love for his grandson, and in that moment, Jason saw something in himself that he had almost forgotten, the chance to do something good. But as the tension in the air began to settle, the weight of what had happened still lingered. And Jason knew, deep down, that the fight wasn't over. These thugs would return, and next time, they wouldn't be so easily defeated. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a melancholic orange glow over the town. The air was thick with the scent of salt water, yet there was no fresh breeze to offer any comfort. The day seemed to move slower than usual, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was distant, muted, like a lullaby for those who still had the peace to listen. Jason's boots echoed in the quiet hallway of the small, dimly lit hospital. He moved like a shadow, his steps deliberate, unhurried, though the tension in his body betrayed the calm he tried to project. His fists were still clenched from the fight he'd just unleashed. His knuckles ached, but the anger inside him burned hotter than any physical pain. He had made his choice. The world wasn't going to get away with hurting Elias, not while he was still breathing. He reached the door to the room, paused for a moment, and took a deep breath. His heart thudded painfully in his chest as the image of Elias, broken and battered, flashed before his eyes. That was the reality of it. A man who had lived a hard, honest life, forced to endure suffering at the hands of men who had no understanding of what it meant to have honor. Elias didn't deserve this. His fragile body, old and scarred from years of working the sea, shouldn't have been subjected to such cruelty. His face, swollen and bruised, had haunted Jason all through the night, lingering in his thoughts as if a constant reminder of the injustice that had unfolded before him. Jason didn't knock. He never did in moments like this. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. Elias was lying in the hospital bed, his form barely noticeable beneath the white sheets. The steady beep of the heart monitor, the sterile smell of antiseptic, everything felt wrong. Jason's jaw tightened as he looked at the older man. The gentle rise and fall of Elias's chest was the only indication he was still alive, still holding on to something, the will to fight, perhaps, or the quiet hope that the world would one day show him kindness again. But at that moment, it was hard to say what Elias held on to most. Elias's eyes flickered open as Jason approached the bed, and for a second, time seemed to stop. There was no need for words. Their silent exchange spoke volumes. Jason's heart clenched at the sight of Elias's weary gaze. The old man didn't need to speak to convey everything Jason already knew. The pain, the fear, the helplessness, it was all there in those tired eyes. And yet, there was something else. A flicker of trust. A flicker of gratitude that Jason was there, standing beside him in his time of need. Jason's throat tightened. He hadn't been a man to show weakness in front of others. The weight of the world rested on his shoulders, and he had always carried it with the silent stoicism of someone who had lived through too many dark days to count. But seeing Elias like this innocent man who had suffered because he had dared to be kind in a world that had forgotten kindness, it broke something inside of him. Jason bent down beside the bed, his face softening. "I won't let them get away with this," he promised, his voice low, raw. It was a vow, a promise not just to Elias, but to himself. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about righting a wrong that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Elias's eyes shimmered with gratitude, but they also held something deeper. A silent plea, a wish that Jason could fix it all. Elias didn't have to say it. Jason could feel it. The old man didn't want revenge. He didn't want violence. What he wanted was something more precious, something that seemed impossible. Dignity, respect, justice, the right to live his life without fear. Jason's hand reached out and gently clasped Elias's frail one. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was about to unfold. For a moment, Jason simply held his hand there, letting the connection ground him. It was the first time he had truly felt that kind of connection in a long time. "I'll make it right," Jason whispered, more to himself than to Elias. There was a long, quiet pause as Jason processed the depth of what he had just promised. It was a turning point, not just for the story that was unfolding, but for Jason as well. The calm storm that had been brewing in his heart finally broke open. He had tried to leave the world behind, tried to disappear into the shadows of his past, but the truth was undeniable. He was never truly free of the ghosts that haunted him. The people he couldn't save, the wrongs he couldn't right, every regret had led him here, to this moment, to this man. And Elias's plight had awakened something deep within him, a part of him that had been dormant for too long. Jason couldn't walk away now. Not after everything he had seen. Not after what Elias had been through. "I'll make sure they pay," Jason said again, quieter this time, his voice heavy with resolve. He wasn't just talking about the thugs. He was talking about the system, the world that allowed men like Elias to be crushed underfoot without so much as a second thought. Elias's eyes closed slowly, a faint, grateful smile tugging at his lips. It was the smallest of gestures, but in that moment, it felt like the world was shifting. For the first time in a long time, there was hope, a glimmer of it. And Jason would do whatever it took to protect that hope, to protect Elias. The storm was coming, but this time, it wasn't just going to be about survival. It was going to be about justice. Jason turned to leave the room, but before he stepped out the door, he glanced back one last time at Elias, still lying there, helpless, but somehow more at peace. Jason's grip on the door handle tightened. He wouldn't fail him. He couldn't. And with that, the door clicked shut, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The calm storm was over. The fight for justice had begun. The night had settled in like a shroud over the town. The streets were quieter than usual, the usual hum of activity replaced by an uneasy silence that echoed through the narrow alleys and empty roads. Jason moved with purpose, each step calculated, each action precise. There was no room for mistakes, no time for hesitation. His mission was clear. The men who had hurt Elias were going to pay. But unlike the reckless violence they had unleashed, Jason's plan was something far colder, more calculated. He was going to dismantle them, piece by piece, and he wouldn't stop until every last one of them had felt the weight of their sins. It was an unsettling kind of peace that took over him in the quiet moments before the hunt began. He could feel the darkness of his past creeping up on him, reminding him of the things he'd done before, the lives he'd taken, the people he'd failed to protect. But tonight, there was a difference. He wasn't operating in the shadows, hidden from the world like he had in the past. Tonight, he was fighting for something, someone, who deserved justice. He stood at the edge of the docks, the salty air stinging his face, eyes scanning the area for any sign of the first thug on his list. The plan was simple, straightforward. He wasn't going to confront them all at once. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, he would take them down one by one, systematically stripping them of their power, exposing their filth for all to see. Jason wasn't here for the thrill of the fight. There was no adrenaline coursing through his veins, no rush of excitement. This was methodical, cold, strategic, the kind of thing he was good at, the thing he'd been trained for. And though he was hunting down men who had caused pain and suffering, a part of him found solace in the precision of it all. There was no chaos, no unpredictability. It was just him, the night, and his enemies. The first man Jason found was waiting in the back of an abandoned warehouse, tucked away from prying eyes. The thug was talking to someone, probably one of his associates, and Jason slipped through the shadows, unseen, unnoticed. He wasn't here to ask questions or exchange words. He didn't need to. The thug had done enough to earn his fate. Jason moved in quickly, his hand pressing against the thug's mouth before he could scream. A swift blow to the side of the head knocked the man out cold. He didn't make a sound as he fell, hitting the floor with a dull thud. Jason didn't bother to tie him up or leave a mark. There was no need for theatrics. He just grabbed the thug's phone and scrolled through it. A few seconds later, he had what he needed, a list of names. Names that were all tied to something much darker than extortion. The thug's life wasn't the only thing Jason was taking tonight. He was taking the power back. From here, it was going to be a steady unraveling. Jason didn't waste time. The next target was a man who ran a small-time drug operation, someone who'd been selling in the shadows, protected by the criminal web that kept the town under its thumb. The man was living in a small, run-down apartment in the middle of town. Jason didn't knock. He just entered through the back window, moving quietly, methodically. The thug was sitting at a table, counting stacks of cash, his back to Jason. A moment of vulnerability, one that Jason wasted no time exploiting. In an instant, he had the man pinned against the wall, his arm twisted behind his back, the cold, calculated look in his eyes as he whispered, "You're going to give me the names of everyone involved, or I'll make sure you never do business again." The thug trembled, his voice shaking as he tried to resist. But Jason wasn't interested in threats. He had already made up his mind. The man would talk, or he would be left broken. With an icy precision, Jason made sure the man understood the severity of the situation. "You don't get to hurt innocent people anymore," Jason said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't anger that made him speak. No, it was something much colder, more unrelenting. He wasn't letting this man walk away. Not after everything he'd done. Minutes later, the thug spilled everything. Names, locations, smuggling operations. The horrors behind the curtain that no one wanted to see. Human trafficking, drugs, extortion. The list was endless, but it didn't faze Jason. He was numb to the ugliness of the world. He'd seen enough to know that this was just the beginning. Jason knew what he was doing. He was pulling apart a system of corruption, piece by piece. The satisfaction wasn't in the takedown itself. It was in the knowledge that these men would never be able to hurt anyone again. Their empire was crumbling, and Jason was going to make sure it stayed that way. By the time Jason reached the third thug, he was operating on instinct. The man was hiding in a safe house, surrounded by guns, money, and a small army of hired muscle. Jason knew this was the one that would be the most difficult to take down. But it didn't matter. Jason had learned long ago that fear was a weapon, and the people who used it were the easiest to break. Jason didn't enter through the front. He never did. Instead, he slipped through the back, moving like a shadow in the night. The thug was inside, surrounded by his men, but Jason knew that was only a small hurdle to overcome. He had a plan, and it was going to work. This man wasn't prepared for the kind of quiet, methodical approach that Jason was bringing to the table. There was no explosion of violence, no massive fight, just a quiet confrontation where Jason's cold eyes locked onto the thugs. A subtle shift, a move too quick for anyone to react to. Jason disarmed him with ease, then grabbed him by the collar, lifting him off the ground. "Tell me where the rest of your operation is," Jason growled, his voice low, filled with deadly calm. The thug's face twisted in fear. Jason could see it in his eyes. The man knew his time had run out. Within minutes, Jason had everything he needed. The thug's associates, their locations, their connections. It was all laid out in front of him, a map of devastation that Jason would be sure to destroy. One by one, Jason hunted down the thugs with the same cold efficiency. Each takedown was quieter than the last, but more satisfying. Each thug's secrets were pulled from them, unraveling their world and exposing it to the light. There was no room for mercy in Jason's heart, not for men like this. They had hurt an innocent man, a man who had nothing left but the will to survive. And for that, they would pay. By the end of the night, Jason stood over the wreckage of the criminal empire they had built. The streets were quieter now, as if the very town itself had exhaled a collective breath. The work wasn't over, but Jason had sent a message. He had shown the world that justice, though often silent, could be swift and unrelenting. Jason stood tall, his heart still heavy with the weight of his past, but there was something else there now, a sense of resolution. The world was dark, but maybe, just maybe, he could make a dent in it. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Because justice was never just about revenge. It was about making the world a little bit better for the ones who still had a chance to fight. And tonight, Elias had that chance. Jason walked away, his silhouette disappearing into the night, knowing that tomorrow would bring more to fix. But for tonight, the scales had balanced, if only for a moment. The night had settled thick over the small town, a heaviness in the air as if even the stars themselves held their breath. Jason walked into the darkness, heading toward the old warehouse where the gang leader had made his lair. The scent of salt and decay hung in the air, a stark contrast to the clear skies earlier in the day. His mind was focused. There was no more room for doubt. Elias had already suffered too much. The gang's reign of terror was coming to an end tonight. He'd already taken down every single thug, one by one, with calculated precision. Their empire was crumbling under the weight of Jason's revenge, and yet, he hadn't been able to shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. The thrill of justice never quite settled in. Every thug he'd taken out had left a mark. Every punch thrown, every life ended, reminded him of the ghosts in his past. But this was different. The gang leader was a monster, the kind that didn't need a reason to be cruel. His reign of terror went beyond money. It was about control. He'd ruined lives, taken them like they were nothing more than toys to break and discard. And now, Jason was here to take back what had been stolen. To show him that no one, no matter how powerful they thought they were, could escape justice. As Jason entered the warehouse, he could see the leader standing by the far wall, surrounded by his remaining men. They'd been expecting him. The leader was tall, well-dressed in a sharp suit that had seen better days. A grimy smile spread across his face. He had the look of a man who had survived everything, a man who thought he was untouchable. His eyes, however, held something different, a glimmer of fear that betrayed his confidence. "You've killed my men. You've destroyed my operation. But you're too late, Statham," the leader sneered, his voice echoing in the empty warehouse. "You think this is about you? This is just business. You were never part of the plan, but here we are." Jason didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged. He didn't care about the leader's words. He had nothing left to say. "You took everything from him," Jason said, his voice low, deadly calm. "From a man who never had anything to begin with. You took his family, his livelihood, and you tried to break him. Now I'm here to make sure you pay for it." The leader let out a harsh laugh, stepping closer, his eyes cold and calculating. "You think you're some sort of hero, don't you? A soldier playing the part of a savior? You're just like me, Statham. The difference is, I'm on top." Jason didn't respond. The last words the leader would ever hear were already hanging in the air, his voice carrying a finality to it. "You're not. Not anymore." Without warning, Jason lunged, fast as a shadow, his fist connecting with the leader's jaw in a brutal punch. The blow echoed through the empty space, The gang leader staggered back, shock and pain filling his eyes. But he was still standing. He tried to rally, swinging wildly, but Jason was quicker, more controlled. The two men collided in a flurry of fists, each punch heavier than the last. The gang leader was no slouch. He'd been in his fair share of fights, but he was no match for Jason. Every strike felt like it was breaking something inside the leader, each one shattering the mask he'd worn for so long. Jason wasn't enjoying this, but he wasn't going to stop until the job was done. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" The leader spat, blood trickling from his mouth as he swung wildly again, his eyes wide with desperation. Jason dodged, and with a precise, savage motion, he grabbed the leader by the throat and slammed him into a nearby pillar. The gang leader gasped for breath, his face turning red from the pressure. Jason's eyes never left his. He could feel the darkness that had clung to him for years, the rage that he'd buried so deep inside. This man had caused that rage to rise, and now Jason wasn't going to let it go to waste. The leader struggled, his hands clawing at Jason's grip, but it was futile. "You don't know who you're dealing with. I'll have you killed." Jason's grip tightened, cutting off the leader's words. The silence between them grew thick. There were no more games, no more threats, just raw, undeniable truth. Jason's voice, when he spoke, was like ice. "You begged that man for money. Now beg the law." The leader's eyes widened with panic, realizing the weight of Jason's words. He dropped to his knees, the fight draining out of him, replaced by fear. "Please, please, don't do this." Jason's expression softened, but only for a moment. His hand fell from the leader's throat, pushing him to the ground with a brutal force. The leader crumpled, gasping for air. Jason stood over him, his stance unwavering. "I'm not here to make deals," Jason said, his voice hard as steel. "You've got a date with justice, and you'll regret every second of it." The leader's pleading face twisted in anger and disbelief as Jason walked away, leaving him to face the consequences. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, closing in on the warehouse as Jason disappeared into the night, his work done. Justice had been served, and the ghosts that had haunted Jason for so long, they were one step closer to being laid to rest. The sun had begun to rise again over the small coastal town. Its light cast a soft glow on the streets that had witnessed so much darkness in the past weeks. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to lift slowly, like the first breath after a long-held sigh. The dust had settled, but the scars left behind would linger. For some, the battle was over, but for others, it had just begun. Elias sat up in the small hospital room, the steady beeping of the heart monitor serving as a reminder that he was still here, still alive. He turned his head slowly, the pain from his injuries still sharp but bearable now. His eyes locked with Jason's, and for a brief moment, the unspoken gratitude between them was enough. Words weren't needed. Jason had saved his life, and in doing so, he had shown Elias a glimpse of hope, a glimmer that had long since faded. Jason sat beside the bed, his face solemn. He had seen so much death, so much pain, but for once, there was a quiet peace within him. This was what mattered. Protecting the innocent. Standing for what was right, no matter the cost. Elias may not have had much, but what he had was worth saving. As Jason stood to leave, Elias reached for something on the small table beside his bed, a small, worn pendant. The same one that had once belonged to his wife, the woman he had loved dearly and lost far too soon. His hands trembled as he pressed the pendant into Jason's palm, his eyes filled with silent gratitude. This is for you," Elias whispered hoarsely, his voice thick with emotion. "She would have wanted you to have it. You were the one who stood when no one else would." Jason looked down at the pendant in his hand. It was simple, nothing extravagant, but its significance was clear. It was a token of a life well lived, a memory of someone who had loved fiercely, and someone who had been lost too soon. Jason nodded solemnly, tucking it into his pocket as a silent promise to keep that memory alive. He gave Elias one last look, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. Outside, the world was still turning. The town, with all its wounds and scars, was slowly healing. But Jason was alone again. He had always been alone. There was no place for him to call home. No family. No ties. Just the road, endless and stretching ahead of him. As he walked down the quiet streets, the weight of the pendant in his pocket was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there were people who could still make a difference. Even in a world full of shadows, there were still those who would stand. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting its light over the land. Jason didn't look back. He never did. Some heroes don't wear capes. Some just know when it's time to stand. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with others. And please, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Until next time, take care.